Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at some cognitive biases, those sneaky little mental shortcuts that can sometimes really mess us up.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to making decisions.
Absolutely.
I was going over the stuff you sent me and the pasted text stuff as well. And it's like, oh my gosh, we make these mistakes all the time without even really realizing it.
Yeah. Right.
And it can be costly.
Oh, yeah. Big time. One of the most common ones, and actually one of the first things that I think we should talk about is the sunk cost fallacy. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah. Is that the one where you kind of keep throwing money at like a failing project just because you've already invested so much in it?
Yes, exactly. Our brains really hate to admit we've made a mistake. So we keep justifying these past decisions, even when it's clearly not rational.
Okay.
The key here is to remember that past investments are gone.
Right.
They're sunk costs. Focus on the future potential, not on what you've already lost.
Makes sense. I mean, like when I was in college, I had this like really old clunker of a car and I kept putting money into it for repairs, but it would just break down like a week later.
Yeah. Yeah.
I probably should have just cut my losses and bought a new car.
Yeah. That's the sunk cost fallacy in action.
Yeah.
And this actually ties nicely into another bias that I think is important to understand. And that's anchoring.
Anchoring?
Yeah. Have you ever noticed, like, when you see a price for something for the first time, like, let's say you're buying a car.
Yeah.
That first number kind of sticks in your head.
Oh, yeah, totally. It sets a benchmark.
Yeah, it does. It's like a mental anchor.
Even if it's not reasonable.
Right. Exactly. Even if it's way too high.
Yeah.
So when you're negotiating, be aware of this. Don't let that initial offer like totally control your thinking.
So I should set like my own anchor before you even walk into the negotiation.
Exactly. Do your research, know what you're willing to pay, and then stick to your guns.
Okay. I like that. That's a good tactic. This whole conversation makes me think about how much we can be influenced by external factors, like without even realizing it,
right.
When we're trying to make decisions. Is there a bias for that?
Oh, absolutely. There's actually a few, but one that comes to mind is the paradox of choice.
Okay.
Have you ever felt overwhelmed by having too many options?
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
All the time. Like every time I try to find something to watch on Netflix, it's like I scroll forever and I end up watching nothing because I just get so overwhelmed.
Yeah, exactly. That's the paradox of choice. It's like we think more options is better, but actually studies show that too many choices can lead to decision paralysis and actually less satisfaction in the end.
That is paradox.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the key here is to try and limit your options.
Okay.
Like before you even start looking at things, what criteria am I looking for? Narrow it down.
Right.
And don't be afraid to go with good enough instead of endlessly searching for the perfect option.
Right. Sometimes you just got to pick something.
Yeah. Making a decision is often better than making no decision at all.
That's true.
No.
Sometimes I just need permission to stop overthinking it and just go with my gut.
Sometimes your gut is right, but sometimes our gut can be influenced by biases too. One that comes to mind is the availability bias. Okay. And this is where we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled, often because they're, very vivid or very dramatic.
Okay, like how people are afraid of flying after a plane crash.
Exactly.
But driving is actually way more dangerous.
Statistically, yes.
Yeah.
Our brains are wired to remember these really emotional events more readily, which totally distorts our perception of risk.
Yeah.
So the key here is to try and be aware of this bias and consciously seek out data and statistics to get a more accurate picture.
So instead of letting those vivid images dominate my thinking,
right,
I should take a step back, look at the numbers.
Exactly.
Be more objective.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm starting to see how understanding these biases can help me make better decisions.
Absolutely. It's about having the right tools in your mental toolkit.
Yeah.
Let's add another one. Confirmation bias. Have you ever noticed how people tend to seek out information that confirms their existing beliefs?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's like people only get their news from sources that align with their political views, or they only listen to experts who already agree with them.
Right. It's like we naturally gravitate towards information that reinforces our worldview, even if it's misleading or incomplete.
Right.
So to counteract this, you have to actively seek out information that challenges your beliefs.
Okay.
Talk to people who have different perspectives. Read articles from opposing viewpoints.
It's like that saying, you can't learn anything new if you're only listening to people who agree with you.
Exactly. It can be uncomfortable, but it's essential for making sound judgments.
That's so true.
Yeah.
And, this makes me think about how this bias can also affect how we judge other people.
Oh.
Right? Like, have you ever heard of the halo effect?
The halo effect? Yes.
Is that the one where we kind of let one positive trait about a person influence our overall impression of them?
Yes, exactly. Like if someone is attractive, we might also assume that they're intelligent and kind.
Right.
Right? We tend to generalize from a single trait, and often it's a very superficial trait. It's like we're putting a halo on them.
Interesting.
So the key here is to try and judge people based on their actions and their character, not on first impressions or superficial qualities.
Right. It reminds me of how easy it is to get caught up in the hype surrounding, a celebrity or a politician.
Oh, for sure.
Just because they're famous or charismatic doesn't mean they're good people or their ideas are actually good.
Absolutely.
Right.
We have to separate the person from their achievements or their image and really evaluate their ideas and their actions independently. Don't be swayed by appearances or charm.
This is all so fascinating. I'm like realizing just how much our brains can really trick us. It's like we have all these hidden biases operating in the background, influencing our decisions without us even realizing it.
Yeah. And that's the first step towards overcoming them is awareness.
Okay.
Once you understand how these biases work, you can start to recognize them in yourself and take steps to mitigate their influence.
Right.
And that's what we're here to help you do.
This has been incredibly insightful. I'm already starting to think about how we can apply these concepts to my own life.
Good.
What other biases should we be aware of?
Well, there's a whole slew of them, and many relate to how we interpret information and assess risk. Let's dive into those next.
Okay, let's do it.
It's interesting how our brains tend to kind of oversimplify things, especially when it comes to risk.
What do you mean?
Well, like the neglect of probability, for example.
Yeah.
We often overreact to these dramatic events, like a heart attack or like a natural disaster, while underestimating the likelihood of more mundane but statistically significant risks like heart disease or car accidents.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's like we're more afraid of the things that are on the news all the time, even if they're less likely to actually happen to us.
Exactly. It's the difference between our emotional reactions and the actual probability of something happening.
Right.
We need to think in terms of probabilities, not just vivid anecdotes.
So it's about asking okay, what are the real chances of this actually happening?
Right.
And what are the potential consequences?
It's a lot, right?
Okay, so instead of letting fear control my actions,
right,
I should take a step back, look at the data, be more objective.
Exactly.
It's like how we were talking about the availability bias earlier.
Right.
We overestimate the likelihood of events that are easily recalled often because they're, vivid or dramatic.
Exactly. It all ties together. And this ties into another bias called the illusion of invulnerability. It's this belief that we're somehow less vulnerable to risks than other people.
Oh, yeah. It won't happen to me.
Exactly. It won't happen to me.
I used to think I was invincible when I was younger.
Yay.
Took a lot of unnecessary risks.
We all do. We all have those moments.
Right. That's true. But it's dangerous to think that way.
It is. It can lead to some reckless behavior. It's important to remember that everyone is susceptible to risk and to take appropriate precautions.
Okay, so awareness is key, as we've been saying. Knowing about these biases can help us make more informed decisions.
Yeah, absolutely.
What other biases are there that relate to how we interpret information?
Well, there's one that's really relevant in our information-saturated world, and that's the story bias. We crave narratives, even if they oversimplify or distort reality.
Oh, I see this all the time on social media.
Right.
People just love to share stories, even if they're not totally accurate or complete.
Exactly. It's why we need to be critical of information, especially when it comes in a nice, neat little package.
Right.
Don't just accept a story at face value. Dig deeper. Look for evidence. Be willing to question the narrative.
It's like that saying, if it sounds too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly.
We got to be skeptical, especially when we're online.
Absolutely. And speaking of online information, let's talk about the false consensus effect.
Yeah.
This is where we overestimate how much other people agree with us.
Oh, like when you see someone post something controversial online and you think, everyone agrees with me. How could anyone think otherwise?
Exactly.
Yeah.
We tend to surround ourselves with people who share our views, which creates this echo chamber and reinforces our existing biases,
right,
which can lead to a really distorted perception of reality.
So how do we break out of these echo chambers?
Seek out diverse perspectives.
Okay.
Talk to people who have different viewpoints, read articles from opposing viewpoints, and be open to the possibility that you might be wrong.
That's a good point. It's so easy to just stay in our own little bubbles.
It is.
We need to make an effort to step outside of them.
We do. It's a challenge, but it's so essential.
Okay, and while we're talking about, social influence, have you ever heard of groupthink?
Oh, groupthink classic.
Yeah, have you ever been in a group where everyone seems to agree, even if you had your own doubts?
Oh, yeah, all the time. It's like nobody wants to rock the boat.
Right.
So everyone just goes along with the group, even if it's not the best decision.
Right. It can be really dangerous.
It can be disastrous in organizations, leading to poor decisions and missed opportunities.
So it's important to speak up, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Absolutely. A dissenting voice can be incredibly valuable.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
And what about the flip side of that? Like when the group thinks they're morally right.
Oh, yeah. The belief in the morality of the group.
Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of critically evaluating the decision, the focus kind of shifts to proving why it's not risky. It's almost a self-justification mechanism.
Interesting.
Yeah, we want to believe that our group is making the right choices, so we downplay the potential downsides.
So we need to be skeptical, even when our group seems united.
Especially when your group seems united. Challenge those assumptions, consider alternatives, and don't be afraid to ask tough questions. It's better to address potential problems up front than to deal with the consequences of a bad decision later on.
That's a good point. It reminds me of how important it is to have a diverse group of people involved in making decisions.
Absolutely.
Different perspectives can help to mitigate these biases and lead to more informed choices.
Totally. And speaking of decision-making, there's another bias we should discuss, and that's the outcome bias.
Okay. I'm intrigued. What is that?
So it's this tendency to judge decisions based on the results, not on the process. So if a decision leads to a positive outcome, we assume it was a good decision,
right?
Even if the reasoning behind it was flawed.
Okay, so it's like saying everything worked out in the end, so it must have been the right decision.
Exactly.
Even if it wasn't based on, good logic or good information.
Precisely. It's a dangerous way to think because it prevents us from learning from our mistakes.
Yeah.
We need to focus on the quality of our reasoning, not just the outcome. So ask yourself, were my assumptions sound? Did I consider all the risks and the potential consequences? Did I gather enough information before I made the decision?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
We can't just rely on, luck or good fortune.
Right.
We have to make sure our decisions are based on solid reasoning.
Exactly.
And a thorough understanding of the situation.
It's about being intentional and thoughtful.
Okay.
Not just hoping for the best.
This is so interesting. I'm realizing how much our brains just try to simplify the world. Even when it comes to complex things like decision-making and risk assessment.
Our brains are constantly looking for shortcuts.
Yeah.
But those shortcuts can sometimes lead us down the wrong path.
Right.
That's why it's so important to be aware of these biases and develop strategies for mitigating their influence.
So it's not about getting rid of biases altogether.
Right.
That's probably impossible.
It probably is.
But about being mindful of them and making adjustments.
Exactly. It's about becoming more aware of our own thinking and developing a more nuanced and critical approach to decision-making.
This has been fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm already starting to see these patterns in my own thinking, and I'm excited to start applying these insights to my own life.
That's fantastic.
So you mentioned loss aversion earlier. I'm really curious about that one. Can we dive into that a little deeper?
Absolutely. This is a powerful one. It affects a lot of areas of our lives, from finances to relationships. It's the idea that...
So we were talking about loss aversion before the break.
Right, yeah.
What is that one all about?
So loss aversion, it's basically the idea that the pain of a loss really hits us harder.
Okay.
Way harder than the joy of an equal gain. It's like our brains are wired to avoid losses at all costs,
Right.
Even if it means missing out on potential benefits.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And it explains why I hold on to losing stocks for way too long.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm more afraid of locking in that loss than I am hopeful of finding a better investment.
Yeah, that's a classic example of loss aversion in action. And it can show up in other areas of life too, like staying in a job you hate just because you've been there a while, or clinging to a relationship that's clearly run its course.
Wow. So we're so focused on what we might lose that we don't even think about what we might gain by making a change.
Exactly.
That's powerful.
It is. And recognizing this bias can be really liberating.
Okay.
It allows us to detach from those potential losses and make decisions based on what's truly best for us in the long run.
So how do we do that? How do we counteract this loss aversion?
Well, one helpful strategy is to kind of like reframe your thinking, you know?
Okay.
Instead of focusing on what you might lose, try to focus on what you might gain by making a change. So for example, if you're thinking about leaving a job, don't dwell on the loss of familiarity or security.
Right.
Focus on the potential for growth, new challenges, a more fulfilling career.
Okay, so look at the opportunity instead of the obstacle.
Exactly. And speaking of opportunities, there's another bias we haven't touched on yet, and that's overconfidence bias.
Overconfidence bias.
Yeah. This one is all about overestimating our own knowledge and ability.
Oh, we've all been there, I think.
Yeah.
Like when you think you can totally handle like a DIY project.
Right.
And it turns into a total disaster.
Exactly. So it's crucial to be realistic about your limitations,
Okay.
Seek out feedback from others. Be willing to adjust your plans based on new information, and don't be afraid to ask for help when you need it.
It's like that saying, pride comes before the fall.
Yeah.
Sometimes we need a little humility to make the best decisions.
For sure. So we've talked about a lot of different biases today.
We have.
Is there like a common thread that runs through all of them?
That's a good question. I think the main thing is that like our brains are constantly trying to simplify the world.
Yeah.
Even when it comes to like complex things like making decisions.
Right.
These biases are like mental shortcuts.
They are.
That helped us in the past, but now they can kind of mess us up.
Yeah. They evolved to help us make quick decisions in a world that was much simpler and less information rich than the one we live in today.
Yeah, it's information overload now.
It is. So that's why it's so important to be aware of these biases and to develop strategies for mitigating their influence.
Right. So by understanding how our brains work,
Right.
we can make better decisions.
More informed.
More rational.
This has been incredible. I feel like I have a whole new set of tools now
Great.
to help me navigate life and make better choices.
That's what we're here for. So remember, awareness is the first step.
Okay.
By recognizing these biases in ourselves and in others, we can make more conscious and deliberate decisions, leading to a more fulfilling and successful life.
And it's not about eliminating biases altogether.
Right.
That's probably impossible.
It probably is.
But about like managing them,
Yeah.
using them to our advantage when we can.
Exactly.
It's about understanding our own minds and using that knowledge to make the best choices possible.
That's a great way to put it. It's about being mindful, intentional, and always open to learning more. Well, this has been a really valuable deep dive. Thanks for sharing your expertise with me and with our listeners.
It was my pleasure. I hope you found it insightful.
I absolutely did. I'm already starting to see the world in a whole new way.
Good.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you some new awareness of the hidden forces that shape your decisions. Remember, knowledge is power. And by understanding these biases, you can take control of your thinking and make choices that are truly aligned with your goals and values.